if I look at the arc of my career and the different series, whether they're mixed media, installation, sculptures, or painting, my focus has always been how to develop a diasporic language rooted from where I was geographically at the time.
Hello and welcome to New Editions, a podcast from the Studio Museum in Harlem. I'm Habiba Hobson, Senior Curatorial Assistant here at the museum and your host. In this series, we bring you conversations with artists whose work have recently joined our permanent collection. The Studio Museum in Harlem was founded in 1968 during an era of political and social turmoil. A group of diverse artists, community activists, and philanthropists came together to create a space in Harlem for artists of African descent, many of whom were not given attention within museums, commercial art galleries, and the larger art historical narrative. Initially, the museum did not collect works of art. Instead, it focused on providing studio space and educational programs for artists and the Harlem community. However, the founders soon realized the need for a collection that celebrated and drew attention to the contributions of artists of African descent. This historic decision has allowed us to build and care for works that tell the profound stories of our time. In this episode of New Editions, I'm so thrilled to be speaking with artist Vladimir Cybil Charlier. Born to Haitian parents and raised between New York and Haiti, Cybil has always been keenly aware of the in-between space that comes with calling two places home. She explores cross-cultural histories through her multidisciplinary practice that reflects both the complexity and beauty of being a part of a diaspora. Initially a painter, she had to find a new medium because of an allergy to a solvent used when working with oil paint. This challenge, however, proved to be expansive, propelling her to move beyond the canvas and into three-dimensional forms. Cybil's practice is further informed by the places she currently lives and works, Harlem and upstate New York, and the ways these locations intertwine with her Haitian roots. As you'll hear in this interview, Cybil speaks about her time as a Studio Museum artist in residence from 1996 to 1997. She also speaks about the music and films that influence her work and how she views liminality not so much as a duality, but more as a dialogue. We also speak about a new addition to our collection, a sculpture titled Billie Zulie, which was created during her residency at the museum. Made of aluminum, fabric, acrylic, sequins, beads, and hardware, this sculpture is like a personal altar. Inside the work's aluminum case is a wooden box. When open, the case reveals an image of a religious female deity, Zulie. She wears a blue veil, necklace, and halo, which are all embellished with matching beads and sequins. The figure carries a pink heart and two pearl beads and is pierced in the chest by a metallic sword. If you'd like to see this now, I suggest you press pause and look up this work, Billie Zulie, on studiomuseum.org. Just search for Vladimir Cybil Charlier. That's Vladimir. I'm aware that you were trained as a painter, but what led you to take up other mediums, mainly installation, sculpture, and mixed media? I know you've sort of returned back to painting now, but yeah, would love to hear from you about sort of your background in visual arts.
I started painting really as a teen. I think at 13, I started taking lesson. And I went to Queens College, CUNY, and started training as an oil painter. By the third year, I had already started incorporating some 3D elements in my work. So one painting had a panel that opened up with a latch. So in hindsight, I could tell that this was coming in many ways. Then I transitioned straight to a master's program at SVA. And the end of my first semester, I realized that I was having some pretty severe allergies to solvent and to oil paint. So here I was in a master's program and having to reinvent what I did. There were conversations around me about where else to look for as source of inspiration for the work. And that whole idea of mixed media, probably originated from that period.
Well, that's so interesting to hear about sort of the origins of the way in which you led kind of from painting to mixed media and installation, and that allergy that you had that almost sort of like propelled you, almost forced you, right, to give that up or to sort of incorporate and think about other mediums and other materials to put into your work. Yeah, I would love to sort of hear a bit about sort of, your ties to Haiti and to New York. You were born in Queens, New York, to Haitian parents, and then grew up between Port-au-Prince and New York. And I'm just curious, what about this duality, the United States and the Caribbean informs your work? And maybe that's changed now, your sort of approach to a Caribbean diasporic visual vocabulary. But I would love to hear you speak about these ties, this duality.
Sure. I was thinking about your question, and I realized that I may have thought initially about it as a duality, but I think that very quickly it became a dialogue, really. And that it's really in the space in between those two geographic space, in the dialogue itself, that the energy and the exchange really resides. And if I look at the arc of my career and the different series, whether they're mixed media, installations, sculptures, or painting, my focus has always been how to develop a diasporic language. Rooted from where I was geographically at the time. Actually, when I was at the Studio Museum, I created an installation which was called In Between Waters. And I think that idea of in-betweenness really started coalescing really then. And I have used that title many times afterwards, sometime in Creole, en deux eaux. So the idea that the in-betweenness itself has validity, and that those spaces could just be next to each other.
That's beautiful. And I love the way that you sort of preface that by saying that the sort of conversation or your thinking around these two places emerged perhaps first from being a duality, but then sort of coalesced into being a dialogue. And I think to me that spoke to this idea of sort of uniting differences and sort of what is the beauty that resides within embracing the ways in which one informs the other rather than thinking of them as separate.
Yeah, I think there's flow. As I was moving my studio a year and a half ago back here, one of the things I found, the great thing about moving a studio is that you go through archive, you go through a bunch of things. And one of the things I found was actually slides of the labels at the Studio Museum, my end of program show, because I wanted to have trilingual labels. And I went back and forth with the curators for several weeks about introducing two other languages besides English on the labels. And I was so adamant that at the end it was accepted, but I felt that it was such a victory that when the show was documented, I had the label documented themselves, because it felt like they had become quite significant in terms of letting those different realities cohabit in some ways. And then when I found them, I told myself I should kind of incorporate those labels in some of my prints. So that's something floating there.
And also sort of bring us through this next question, which is more sort of centered around the artist in residence that you involved in 1996. And, before sort of delving into the work, Billie Zulie, I'd love if you're able to walk us through a day in your life as an artist in residence at the Studio Museum, sort of just thinking back through that time period and, your artistic development and sort of what were you conceiving at that time? How did the residency serve as an incubator of your artistic development?
I think that incubator is actually the right word. because I could see that they were more than seed, but that ideas really start crystallizing and that were fully explored later on in later series. So when I came in, one of the first thing I did is I became fascinated with, I started walking around the neighborhood, and I had not been in Harlem on a regular basis since my childhood, when I used to, my parents had a theater group that rehearsed in the basement of the French House at Columbia University. So my early childhood, a lot of time was spent in my early childhood zooming from Queens through 125th to the Columbia campus. And it took a few weeks actually to even remember that. So I started walking around the neighborhood and really shooting images of the fire escape. I was really fascinated by the wrought iron design, which reminded me a lot of some of the design I had seen in the Caribbean in Haiti. I started doing some research and learned that a lot of the blacksmith had indeed come from the Caribbean, sometime not willfully, gone to the South or being transported to the South if they didn't migrate on their own accord, and from then made their way north. So kind of interesting, because a lot of the architecture, we have the same thing that has happened with the architecture too. So that was one of the series I started doing, was incorporating the fire escape design with some historical imagery I had shot in Haiti for my first trip. I also had a very big piece I did with imagery of bottles stemming from a narrative, a childhood narrative of being in Queens, in Lafrac City, which is one of the places I grew up in Queens. And a figure piece with an overlay also, and that was a 3D piece with plastic yo-yo quilts which is a form of quilting that emerged during the time of the Great Depression. And the figure was fully covered with this. And I didn't use them again in my practice until the pandemic, when I went back to painting, and they are in some of my pieces right now, like right here. So that was interesting how that arc happened. And in between developing that series, I also was managing a pretty serious health crisis when I was at the residency, and that emerged kind of midway through. And June and I started really chatting about collaborating on a piece. And we started talking about, somehow we, through a lot of dialogue. At the time, we had one room that really was separated with half walls. So we were in a same physical space every day. Most of all the subway maps that were in the subway stopped at 96th Street. So if you were going beyond 96th Street, you needed to make a note ahead of time, because you wouldn't be able to check your location and forget about the Bronx. Doesn't exist at all. Didn't exist. So we actually decided to do an installation that really emphasized the upper part of Manhattan and put 125th as Midtown, which is geographically really what it is. And then we created little altars that really dealt with our background. June is from Harlem and saw everything from fire escape, and so her little altars. I remember there was a shoe filled with popcorn, and so she had a few. And I decided to create my own altar. So the question to myself was, well, altars. We have a tradition of altars. Well, what if the gods, the Lois, landed in Harlem? What would they look like? So I created the first three that went of that whole series. So it was Billie Holiday as Zulie, Malcolm X as Ogu, the god of war, and Miles Davis, which was three little hats. And on each of the hat was Bert of the Cool as the Lord of the Underworld, Baron Samedi. So that's a little bit of how my work really developed during the residency.
Wow. I remember you sort of thinking or telling us about this issue of the subway map, which I find so wild, but also indicative of, the politics of the city, who is visible, who's not visible, who is considered part of the city and who's not. right? And so, yeah, but thinking sort of practically about where Midtown actually is, it's interesting, right, to think about Harlem as the Midtown of, the city that stretches up to the Bronx and down to Lower Manhattan. Wonderful. And I want to talk, I guess, a bit more about this work, Billie Zulie, which I'll pull up right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would actually love for you to perhaps, walk us through this work, walk us through both the box itself and then also the work. And maybe if you're able to sort of explain your process of like actually physically making, like, so what were the components sort of involved in the process of actually constructing this work?
Sure. Well, I started pretty much with the painting part. So I created a little cloth, piece, painting, and it's all diluted acrylics, basically, with markers and beads and sequins. I had been using beads and sequins as cultural markers, a nod to the voodoo flags. Really, I created this, but this is all pre-Photoshop. So once I created the image of the Dolorosa, which is the Catholic saint that has come to represent Zulie, which is the goddess of love in her lover's form. So I have to backtrack a little bit because that whole series is really based on the image of using images as decoy. And it's a practice that's really an act of resistance and spiritual and cultural survival, because both pre and post independence in many of the Caribbean islands and in Haiti and in South America, the enslaved African and their descendants were not allowed to openly practice Afro-diasporic religion, whether voodoo, candomblé, Santeria. So they started using a lot of images of the saints, since there's so much decorum. And in this case, in Haiti, it was Catholicism. So there was an abundance of images of saints and of imagery as decoy to represent the different deities. It's not always the case that the images are saints. Sometimes it's a lay image also that for whatever reason become a stand-in for the deity. One of the ones that I find most fascinating is the image, the poster of Nastasia Kinski, where she's laying down naked with the snake around her, that you could find in Vodou temple as representing the snake god Dambala, or the image of a snake charmer. So there are other images that are not religious based, but the majority of them are. And in this case, I decide to take the practice one step further and to take it back in a way, and to literally, in this case, pre-Photoshop, sew the image, the face of Billie Holiday as the deity of love in her lover's form.
Wow, no, thanks for that like full overview also of the use of images from sort of Catholicism as a way to sort of embody spiritual deities. I think this is such an interesting point that I had no idea about. And I was recently researching through your work, the image of the Black Madonna that's in a church in Poland.
Dontor, yeah, the series.
Interesting. And yeah, I guess curious also too about this larger project, both in terms of where you're going now and also in terms of just thinking back to the IIR program and you working with June and thinking through the subway map and sort of creating this work, creating these mini altars. I guess I'm curious about like social implications, meaning what did you seek to comment on or be in conversation with through the making of these little altars? And I guess how has that changed now as you're continuing to think through some ideas that you had sort of initially got going with during the residency?
I think that it very much, it speaks about the process of migration and immigration and what happens to cultures, right, and to identity. So if you think about the timeline, identity politics really bloom during that period and right after. So it really talks about that. And in many ways, that same process that maybe is illustrated here really started with the generation of my parents migrating here with all their belief. And even before, because my parents were not the first one. My granduncle migrated at the turn of the 20th century and ended up having a salon during the Harlem Renaissance. And so whenever people move to a different place, the culture moves in. And so this is really talking about the flow. And this started really before. I mean, if you think about what happened in the process of the transatlantic slave, okay, all the belief and the knowledge that traveled to the Caribbean, to the Americas, and to Europe, actually, that is exactly what has happened, where culture gets reinvented as a mean of survival, but also it gets updated.
Yeah, no, completely. I mean, I think there's so much that you said that sort of can dovetail into so many different conversations around, around migration, around, again, this idea of dialogue rather than duality, this idea of dialogue, this idea of sort of embracing the new culture, or sort of like the new sentiment, the new sort of energy that's coming into a place. And rather than sort of look at that as separate, how can that be sort of joined in with what energy is already happening in the place that people are migrating to? And yeah, I would argue the same, that this has happened, since the transatlantic slave trade. Certain sort of aspects of culture that derive from the continent being sort of infused into practices happening here in the US, or in Europe, or in the Caribbean. And because I'm also just thinking about like the maneuvering of the box too, and sort of like the sculptural element of it, the sculptural and structural element of this work being something that you can sort of almost carry with you and place for as a reminder, or as a sort of a method of prayer, as a method of remembrance. And so, yeah, I guess just to sort of cap off this conversation around this beautiful work.
Yeah, it's a personal altar for sure. It was displayed in that installation initially, but it's a personal altar. And I use aluminum because it's a metal that is white. It's the moon, it's female energy. So the material also echoed to that divinity per se. But also, this is a process that happened two ways. If we think about the impact that American music has had on world culture, it is very much the same process,
Totally. And also, yeah, I guess it's interesting also, and this, I'm going back to what you had said about your grandfather also having a salon in Harlem, and you coming back and almost kind of referencing, of course, Caribbean history, but also referencing like your own personal history, own familial history, having already sort of had time in Harlem, your grandfather. So that's awesome to...
My granduncle.
Your granduncle, rather. Okay. That's really awesome to hear about. Great. Thanks so much for telling us more about this work. Is there anything else that you want to add about this work before we move on?
No, I think that's it. And the box honestly was kind of me having fun while creating the piece. So I was tickled by the fact that the wine box was such a perfect fit for it. And kind of piggyback about that idea of recycling material that you find, for example, in a quote unquote shanty town, or the favelas. So I kind of really liked that idea.
Yeah, I love that too. Awesome. Yeah, so it's just to sort of transition now into thinking through other things about your practice. I'm curious to hear about your inspirations, I guess, sort of thinking through what would be your artistic bibliography. Which writers, thinkers, artists, or filmmakers or films would you include in this bibliography, and why?
All right, so I'm omnivorous. And that goes from my music all the way to my literary taste. I started reading and rereading Baldwin during the lockdown, and it's been pretty present since then. Derek Walcott has always been in a big influence, and I'm thinking Omeros is definitely my go-to book. Texaco by Patrick Chamoiseau. I'm thinking Junot Diaz, some of his writing. Early on, I must say that I felt that I found echo for that language that I was trying to develop more in many writers than I did in visual artists at first. So Love, Anger, Madness by Maggie Chauvet. Right now, I just finished reading the biography of a yogi by Yogananda. Louise Nevelson's last biography, which I love, by Laurie Wilson. And a book that I found totally fascinating is called Initiated by the Spirit, Healing the Ills of Modernity Through Shamanism. Psychedelic and the Power of the Sacred by Frederick Appel Margolin. So one of the things that I've done as I've gone back to that series and decided to really expand and conclude it is I have also joined Asirire, which is an Orisha temple led by Dr. Iya Fulayo Wood-Menzies, who's both a Harvard scholar and a priestess. And as part of that, there is an Akeko Circle, which is really a curated book club. So I have access to an amazing selection of books that deals with the sacred, the divinity in the African diaspora. And very often there are scholars that are invited. And if cannot make it, I listen to those also while I work in the studio. So I've been reading. Sometime I'll miss something and then I'll catch up later. But so a lot of my reading has been very much directed by that, and by me wanting to balance. So while I'm very open to the work flowing, but then afterwards, I really like to go back and read and to understand from a different place and contextualize, and being able to contextualize what comes through. In terms of movies, I think one of my favorite movies is Orfeo Negro, a Brazilian movie. It's incredible. And I must say that I'm very fond of Ty Jones as a playwright for the Classical Theater of Harlem, because I feel that a lot of the plays that he puts through, which are right in my neighborhood, really echo that sensibility in so many ways and really jive with what I'm doing as a visual artist. I have been kind of obsessed with the music of Miles Davis the past year, I must say. I listen to so many things, from Sonia Jabarte to, Joyce Samara, to anything by Prince at all. But jazz and the jazz classic have been an incredible, I think, influence and pretty much seminal in my last body of painting. So,
wow, very cool. Thanks so much. I have my own bibliography to get through of yours now. So thanks so much for all these recommendations. It's awesome to hear about like what books and films and things are on artists' minds. Yeah, Orfeo Negro is definitely one of my favorite movies that I saw when I was actually I think when I was like 10 or 11 or 12, I saw that. We used to have the DVD and we would just play it all the time when DVD players were a thing. But now it's on YouTube. I found that it's on YouTube.
Really? Okay, it's good to know.
Yeah, it's a bit lagged at times, but it's on YouTube. It's such a beautiful, beautiful film. And if I'm remembering correctly, yes, you're now working upstate. And I guess, yeah, what are you thinking about in relation to your practice now and what lies ahead? What are you looking forward to this next year? Just celebrating your recent exhibition at Garner Arts Center, or kind of recent exhibition at Garner Arts Center. But yeah, would love to hear about sort of what you're working on. What are some unrealized works that you have yet to produce? And
Sure. So I have developed a series of 22 prints for the Pantheon, which has been my longest running series, which I started during a residency at the Studio Museum, where I cast heroes and sheroes of the African diaspora and of Africa also. I have Nelson and Winnie Mandela in there as the different deities of Afro-diasporic religion. So there are 2 editions as well as a kit, a portfolio that contains all 22 images. That's called the Diaspora Vodou Survival Kit. It contains also a table of content poster that has the veves, which are the ritual diagrams, symbolic and that of each deity, as well as a limited edition of ceramics of an asson, and it looks like a gourd on the other side, which I like because the gourd was one of the constellation that people look when they needed to go north. So I like that it on one side it's a gourd, and on the other side it's the asson, which is the ritual rattle, and which I actually did that ceramic edition the previous summer during my second residency at Skowhegan. So the interesting thing about this Pantheon, which is so based and rooted in those practices, is that when you look at how it has developed, it really is based in a communal energy, right? Like it starts in a residency, and then I work with a master printer, and then I go to Skowhegan, and some of it gets developed there. And that's really the energy that you have in what you call in Lakou, or that you had traditionally, and you still have in Africa, where the family is so important. And you have the idea of the community that supersedes the individual. So that's really the energy of that body of work.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Cybil. That concludes sort of my questions about your practice and the work, but we do have a series of 3 questions that we ask all interviewers, all interviewees, which begin with the idea of your version of a morning. It used to be walk me through your morning, and then the previous interviewee, Jade, said, well, what if I don't wake up in the morning? What does that mean? So I've changed the language to now be walk me through your version of the start of your day, of your morning. How do you start your day, Cybil?
Okay, so I wake up between 6 and 7, and I go straight to my meditation chair and I meditate for about 20 minutes, but sometimes I'll go on. And then I'll do an exercise routine. Right now I'm doing yoga, Pilates, or a dance routine. And then if the kitten is screaming, I have a new kitten in the house, then I have to run down to feed it. But I get ready basically and prepare a smoothie usually for breakfast that either I have there or I bring in the car with me, and prepare my lunch and then head to the studio. So I give myself time. Now I'm comfortable getting to the studio between 10:30 and 11. And usually I don't come back down until later on, unless I have something to attend in town. So
wonderful. Thanks so much for sharing. Sounds similar to my morning. And I think we talked about this when we met. It's like, oh, you do this too. You wake up early too. So awesome. Awesome to hear again. And yeah, this next question I've also changed as well, given Jade's feedback. And so it's now, if you suddenly had access to unrestricted funds and resources, what is a project or activity you take on? And no matter sort of the scale, what is sort of like a big project or a big idea that you would love to execute if time and resources allowed?
I've had that residency idea for many years, which kind of has evolved. where I would like to have a residency in different communities and immigrant communities that is craft-based, really working with the craft traditions of different populations, not from the Caribbean, from Latin America, from Africa, and from the South of the United States. And really have an integrative space, not just for fine artists, but also for people from the community who are masters at creating those crafts outside of an art context. I've had an idea for a residency also for mid-career that would specifically be for mid-career artists.
Mm.
Yeah. So,
Mm-hmm.
and their family.
Yeah. Man, that's such great ideas and so needed too. Yeah, that's so interesting. Thanks so much for sharing. There's just, I guess, one more sort of, it's not a question, more of a prompt. Can you please share one question that you'd like for me to ask the next artist?
How does your past and your present interact in your current work?
Fantastic question. I'm really looking forward to seeing the way that the next person answers this. Really, really appreciate you for making time. Happy that we were able to make this work and sort of speak again about your incredible work that's in our collection. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation between me, Habiba Hobson, and artist Vladimir Cybil Charlier. Cybil's work has just been added to our collection. It's a sculpture titled Billie Zulie that is made of aluminum, fabric, acrylic, sequins, beads, and hardware. The Studio Museum in Harlem is the nexus for artists of African descent locally, nationally, and internationally, and for work that has been inspired and influenced by Black culture. It is a site for the dynamic exchange of ideas about art and society. We invite you to get to know our collection and follow along on our journey to building our new museum in Harlem. For more information on Cybil and all of the artists in this series, you can visit studiomuseum.org. You can access these links and more in the show notes. My name is Habiba Hobson, Senior Curatorial Assistant here at the museum and your host. New Editions is produced by Sound Made Public with Tanya Katengian, Philip Wood, Alessandro Santoro, and Jeremiah Moore. This podcast would not have been possible without members of the Studio Museum's curatorial and communications departments, especially curator Connie H. Choi, Associate Director of Digital Marketing and Communications Shauna Kudowitz, Managing Editor Meg Whiteford, and Director of Marketing and Communications, Isida Jansene. Special thanks to Senior Director of Learning and Engagement, Shanta Lawson, and Director of Education, Chloe Hayward. Much gratitude to Studio Museum donors and patrons, particularly those who purchased or gifted works for the Studio Museum's collection that are featured in this series. Our theme music was created by Mandingo Ambassadors. The cover image was created by Studio Museum's senior graphic designer, Megan Tatum. To learn more about this series, please visit studiomuseum.org/magazine. And please share this conversation, write a review, follow us on Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. Take care.